Colonel Kemp, that's a difficult presentation to follow. A, because I agreed with everything you said. B, because it's very gratifying to hear it being said from someone who's experienced like yourself. Perhaps the starting point for me would be something a bit unpleasant, which I encountered when Gil showed it to me when I came here this morning. It's a publication on an internet website from someone who claimed to have been invited to speak at this conference. I don't know if you've seen it. It's by a person called Anthony D'Amato. You did invite him, I assume? And he wrote that he decided not to come to this conference, and I quote from the website, "I will not attend because it isn't a conference, it's a PowerPoint presentation. Every speaker on the agenda is an advocate of the Israeli position. There isn't an independent scholar of international law, much less a Palestinian, on the list of speakers." Now, I am looking at this panel, and there's one general, 3 colonels, and 1 major. So I think there is a artificial or superficial basis to say that we are all alike, but we're definitely not all alike. And as I'll try to make the point over the next few minutes, I think what Mr. D'Amato wrote just proves who he is, not who we are. Let me start by saying that over the last several years, after I retired from the army in 2004, I have been asking myself a lot of questions about what do I think and how do I classify myself. And in a recent lecture in the Kiryat Ono College, where's Dr. Cohen? He's somewhere here. I said to an audience of people, many of whom know me, that I actually think I should classify myself as a human rights lawyer. Now, anyone who knows my background and how many years I spent in counter-terrorism, that doesn't seem like an obvious choice. But I have 2 things to say about this. The first thing is I have a very good friend who's an expert in labor law, but he only represents large-scale companies. I have a partner in my firm who's a world expert on environmental law, but she only represents polluting companies. But no one argues that they are experts in their field. So how come when I say that I'm a human rights expert, everyone says, no, it can't be. That's not your field. You don't do human rights. You violate human rights. You help governments violate human rights. And that reminded me of the joke, and I think it's a good point to put in a joke, about the priest, the rabbi, and the Israeli taxi driver who all died and went to heaven. And they were told that they would receive housing on the basis of their contribution to the holy cause. And the priest got a very nice apartment with a very good view. The rabbi got an even better apartment on a higher floor with a better view. And suddenly both of them see that the Israeli taxi driver gets a huge villa on a hill. So they both go to the angel in charge and say, I mean, we dedicated our lives to God. How come he gets the villa? And the angel said, in 1 day of driving, he puts the fear of God into more people than you did in all of your life. In that respect, I am the taxi driver. Because I think the people who work in our field do more for human rights than probably most of the human rights lawyers working in the field. But the problem is that what I say now will not be accepted by them. And this is the crux of my discussion with you today. You see, there are clubs in international law as in international politics which you cannot be joined and will not be asked to join if you don't hold the right opinions. Mr. D'Amato didn't want to come here because he felt he was in the wrong club. Now, until the year 2000, Israel classified the fight against terror as a criminal law enforcement scenario. In the West Bank or Gaza Strip, during the first Intifada, during all the operations up to the year 2000, the goal of IDF soldiers when entering the West Bank or Gaza was 1, to arrest suspected terrorists. IDF rules of engagement during that period, and I helped draft them for quite a long time, had a different name. They were called rules for the detention of suspects. There were no rules of engagement in military parlance in effect in the West Bank or Gaza Strip. We had none, except you are allowed to use your rifle in self-defense. That's it. IDF soldiers were using their capabilities solely as policemen. And that is the format that Israel fought Palestinian terrorism from 1967 until the year 2000. In the year 2000, when the second Intifada broke out, we identified, and I say we because there are a lot of people here in this room who are part of this discussion. There's Pnina, and there's Gil, and there's Amidro, and there are other people, Roy over there, who all were part of this discussion. And we looked at it and we said, well, first of all, the scope of the fighting is immense. It doesn't look like sporadic stone throwing or Molotov cocktail throwing or riots. Secondly, the type of equipment they're using is not the equipment of criminals. I mean, they're not using stones or such like, although a stone can kill, of course. But we were encountering live fire from machine guns, from mortars, from surface-to-surface missiles, from one-ton bombs hidden under the asphalt when the tanks come into the town. And I can go on and on and on. Military hardware. And they weren't fighting in sporadic groups. Some of them were quite organized, what we would professionally call guerrilla or militia armies. And it was happening everywhere. It was in the West Bank, it was in Gaza, it was in Israel, it was everywhere. And when we looked at all of this, and there's a famous saying, if it looks like a duck, it quacks like a duck, then it's a rose. Or in our case, it looked like a war, it felt like a war, it killed like a war. And when I say it killed like a war, if we look at the years between 2000 and 2005, if I remember my statistics right, Israel suffered approximately 7,200 casualties over that 5-year period. I think that's around 1,200 deaths and around 600 injuries. That's soldiers and civilians alike. Now, that may not sound like a lot if you're an American, but actually if you take the population of Israel, that means every Israeli out of 800 was either killed or injured in a terror attack in a 5-year period. Now, if I translate that ratio into, let's say, the US, that would be equivalent to 300,000 American casualties, which is only 100 times the scope of September 11th, just for the sake of comparison. No wonder we felt we were at war. So in the year 2000, Israel, including Israel's lawyers, some of whom are in this room, came to the conclusion that this is no longer a law enforcement issue, that we're no longer required to send our soldiers as policemen to arrest the people firing the machine guns at us, that we have passed a certain, as yet undefined and undesignated threshold, and we are now in the world that we call then armed conflict, or you could call war against terror. Now, this new idea was really new. I mean, no one had said this anywhere else before. But it seemed the right thing to do. So one of the things we were responsible for was to try to sell this idea to other countries. And I want to tell you 2 examples of my failures in this regard. First, Colonel Kemp, I'll tell you about a meeting with the Deputy Minister of Defense of the United Kingdom. This is in 2002, and he has with him a colleague, a British general, who was then going to command 2 weeks after the meeting, the British forces in Iraq. And what? No, in Iraq. He was going to command British forces in Iraq. And I explained to them our idea of crossing the threshold into the world of armed conflict against terrorism. And that I said that we are now allowing the Israeli army to use military hardware and technology techniques and modus operandi to fight terrorism. And I think the deputy minister's called, he was actually a retired British admiral, said to me, and I grew up in England, so I understand British understatement. He said to me, I've been listening to you speak with an ever-increasing feeling of hostility. Which, if I translate that from an English version, let's say, to an American version, he probably got up and hit me in the nose. So I said, how come? And he said, you've got it all wrong. Terrorism isn't a military affair, and it doesn't address international law. It's everything to do, it's an internal matter. And I saw the Northern Ireland bubble above his head while he was speaking. And I turned to his colleague, the general, and I asked him, General, do you agree with your colleague? And he said, yeah, actually, I do. And then something strange happened. And then I asked him, but you're going to go to Iraq in 2 weeks. Will you still agree with your colleague in 1 month after the first Iraqi suicide bomber attacks your forces? And then he looked at me and he said, and he wasn't joking, and he said, then I'll probably agree with you. That was my first failure. The second failure is, Amidro talked earlier about my other life as part of the Israeli peace negotiating teams. Some of those chapters are best left closed. And when we came back from Camp David, you may recall that President Clinton still had some hope that he could revive the peace process, and he decided to appoint a fact-finding commission and he asked the fact-finding commission two questions. The first was, why had the violence broken out? And the second, how was it possible to bring the peace process back online? You may know the person who was in charge of that committee. He's a rather well-known character, almost got the Nobel Peace Prize for his efforts for bringing about the Good Friday Agreement in Northern Ireland. He's now a well-known character in Israel. His name is George Mitchell. So he headed that committee. And George Mitchell and his committee came here, and I appeared before the committee, and I explained to them our concept of war against terrorism and the fact that we need to change our perspective and to address the question of what laws apply, etc., etc. And I did a very bad job. Because on the 30th of April, Mitchell and his committee published their recommendations to the new President George Bush. And in those recommendations, they specifically called for the State of Israel to take back its classification of the dispute with the Palestinians as an armed conflict, and to go back to the law enforcement approach which Israel had heretofore applied. And as I say sometimes in lectures in the United States, it took 4 months and 4 aircraft to change the mind of the US government. Because after September 11th, and Amidro talked about this, the world changed for a moment. And the easiest way to say it, the Americans got it. But as Americans do it, they got it, and then they went a bit too far. So if Israel goes into Gaza after its attack, the Americans conquer 2 countries. But generally speaking, the response was, we now understand what you're talking about. When Israel developed the idea of unlawful combatants, actually Pnina had a large role to play in that, and the Americans at first didn't like that very much. They adopted it wholeheartedly after 2001. Took it much further than we ever even thought possible. So, there comes September 11th. But if you think September 11th solves Israel's problems, you're wrong. In 2002 or 3, I don't remember the date, I got a letter in my office. I think, Nina, I don't know if you remember this one. It was a letter from a British lawyer. He wrote to me as follows: Dear Colonel Reisner, I got your name from someone who knows both of us, mutual colleague. And I am a defense counsel in the ICTY, the International Criminal Court Tribunal for former Yugoslavia, and I'm representing certain general blah blah, I don't remember his name. And he's accused of war crimes, and he gave me the list of war crimes he's accused of. And we are now preparing the defense team, and we have gone through the alleged crimes, and we have come to the conclusion that most of what he's charges is what your country is doing to the Palestinians in the West Bank. So we thought it would be very useful if you could recommend who could join us on our defense team, etc., etc. Now, my first response, I didn't laugh, actually. I was shocked. And I said, what an anti-Semitic British lawyer. And then I reread it, and I understood that, and asked a few questions later on, and then I got it. He had no idea that he was being anti-Semitic. He actually thought that what he wrote was true. Because from his objective perspective, it seems like the same complaints. And then, for the first time, it dawned upon me that I was working for the bad guys. You see, the world, there are 2 kinds of hats in the world. Because of the media, not because of reality. And because of the fact that people never ask questions deeper than who are the good guys and who are the bad guys. I mean, when I teach courses in universities, and I want to make this point, I ask students to explain to me who was fighting whom in Kosovo. Or who's fighting who in Colombia, or in Sri Lanka, or in Rwanda. Now, the Israelis are very good at telling me what happened here, but if I go to another conflict, most people have no idea what I'm talking about. But the same works the other way around. Most people have absolutely no idea what we're talking about here. They don't really care. They've got a sound bite. They know who the good guys are and who the bad guys are. And for a variety of reasons I won't go into, we are now the bad guys. And then it's obvious that bad guys united means that if someone else does something bad, it's automatically associated with it. About 3 months ago, I was interviewed for, I think, ITN, British television, by a journalist, a very intelligent journalist, who was very, very antagonistic to me during the interview. Now, it's very difficult to answer nasty questions such as, how do you respond to the fact that Israel has continued to commit war crimes in spite of the fact that the international community has told you to stop? This is live television. I mean, where do you start? And at the end of the interview, we had a few minutes to talk. It was in my office. And I asked him, what do you actually think about us? Because your question seemed to denote that you have an opinion. And he said, yes, I think you are the troublemakers. And I think if it weren't for you, this part of the world would be quiet. And I said to him, are you aware of the fact that for many Israelis, we actually liken ourselves to Sparta? That we are the 300 crazy people standing in the past, stopping the flood of Islamic fundamentalists from actually swooping over Europe, and we're covering your backs? And he laughed and said, you can't really believe that's true. That can't be your picture of yourself. And it hits me again that people really, really don't believe us when we say what we really believe, which is a problem. Because if they don't think you're serious, they don't take you seriously. Now, there's another problem. Not only have we been classified as the bad guys, but there's another element which this table all shares. Military people, armies, and people like us are no longer in favor. In this new world we live in, the majority of the people have outgrown wars, or at least they think they have. And therefore we are viewed as the old guard, the people who are still fighting while the rest of the world has moved beyond that. I want to give you an example. I think this was in 1998 or something. I remember I discovered that UNESCO, a United Nations organization responsible for cultural property, was convening a conference on the protection of cultural property in wartime. Now this is a very important topic for Israel as well, because cultural property can mean a mosque, for example. So there are a lot of things you have to be careful about, and I wanted to know what the developments were. So we had the budget for trips abroad, so I bought a ticket and I went to the conference. And I sat in the conference, it's in Paris, and I start listening to the proposals being put on the table. And there are about, let's say, 300 or 400 people from 150 countries in the room. I mean, I'm just the Israeli delegation. And they're talking about the fact that there should be a new protocol which should totally prohibit any damage to cultural property in warfare, even at the cost of soldiers' life. And I'm saying to myself, okay, I can understand Mona Lisa, but if you're talking about a religious icon which someone sculpted 20 years ago and put in a church somewhere, no, I'm not going to sacrifice a soldier's life for this thing. I'm sorry, but I don't think it's that important. And when the conference goes on for the second day, I raise my hand and I start asking these questions. What happened to the principles of military necessity, the fact that there should be a balance? And in fact, if you're allowed to kill civilians inadvertently in conflict, how come you can't destroy cultural property inadvertently? And only then did I understand that actually I was shocked to learn I was the only military person in the entire conference. Everyone else were museum curators. Only they had been invited. I came of my own, it was my idea to come. This group of people, all like-minded, all, by the way, totally dedicated to humanity, I totally accept. No one was presenting the other party. And actually what happened as a result of my participation, we came back in force next time. All of the Western countries came in with the military lawyers. But the organizers tried to shut me up, I think, put me in charge of drafting part of the protocol. By the way, I helped draft the protocol, and then I made sure we never signed it. Now, this brings me to my point. It is extremely important that Israel's positions be heard. There is a huge tendency among people to say, we've already lost the fight. Rubbish. If we don't engage, we will lose the fight. The fight, the lawfare fight, the legitimacy fight, the legal fight, the war crimes fight. If we keep quiet, then we will lose. Because the other people, some of them actually hate us, which is true, but most of the normal people don't hate us in person once you get to know us, but they do hate us in principle because we are the bad guys. And so I think I have 3 recommendations with which I'll end. The first is, before we engage anyone, and I view this as of utmost importance, we must make sure that, I'm now copying from Colonel Kemp, that we are whiter than white. And I don't think we've done enough on that. I am uncomfortable with the fact that the speed of the investigations of allegations against IDF forces is so slow that when we come up with results, no one believes them because they're 6 months too old. And I cannot accept that it takes 6 months to find out what happened in conflict, although I know it does. But we have to find a way to do it quicker and to get up with a good, valid, and if not 100%, then 99% accurate answer quicker than we can do today. And we need to also look at the way we actually investigate ourselves, because I'm not sure we found the right balance yet. But once we understand what we did right and what we did wrong, armed with that moral and legal ammunition, we should actively engage A, public opinion everywhere, anywhere, even if we are the odd man out. I have been the odd man out on more than one occasion in international conferences where I felt like the sacrificial lamb. It's worth it. If we expect our soldiers to enter Gaza and to risk their lives, forgive me, for a lawyer to go into a hostile environment and maximum what can happen, they'll boo you, so they'll boo you. Nothing bad can happen. And the third thing I think we should be doing is, we should recognize the fact that we are not alone. Almost every single military officer and military lawyer in the world actually thinks we're right. And if he doesn't think we're right on the details, he thinks we are in the right area. He may have a disagreement with us on how to use force, how much force, exactly what proportionality means, but the language is the same, the dialogue is the same. These are people who are like-minded not because they like Israel. I have had great friends from Denmark, from Sweden, countries who have absolutely no basis for a very favorable relation with Israel. It's because they have been where we have been and they understand the dilemma. And once they understand the dilemma, they are willing to actively engage on finding a solution. And that is a target group that we should, and here I'm following up on Colonel Kemp's idea, we should actively engage, create a coalition of like-minded states, not pro-Israeli states. They could all be countries that don't like us. But the people there who make a difference are the people who know what we're talking about. And there is safety in numbers. The more important, intelligent, understanding people from different countries say, look, the Israeli viewpoint isn't crazy and they're not necessarily the bad guys, the less there will be a tendency to associate us with the Serbs and the other countries which are obviously now on the side of the blacks. On this point, I will end, and thank you very much.